Have you ever noticed how love can feel like a game of emotional tug-of-war? One person pulls, the other resists. But what happens when the one who's always chasing finally stops running after someone who keeps pulling away? This moment, when the anxious stops chasing, becomes a turning point. And for the avoidant partner, it's the moment panic sets in. In many relationships, especially those that feel emotionally unstable or confusing, there's often an invisible dynamic playing out beneath the surface. One person tends to lean in, constantly seeking closeness, reassurance, and emotional intimacy. This person often feels anxious when their partner pulls away or becomes emotionally unavailable. They notice the small shifts, the quiet tones, the unanswered messages. Every action, or lack of it, feels like a sign of rejection. So they respond by trying harder, sending longer messages, initiating more often, making more compromises. They're trying to close the emotional gap because distance doesn't feel safe to them. They're the anxious one. On the other side, you have someone who feels overwhelmed by too much closeness. They value independence, space, and often associate deep emotional connection with vulnerability they're not comfortable expressing. To them, emotional closeness can feel like a loss of control, or worse, a threat. When they sense someone getting too close, they begin to retreat. Not because they don't care, but because they're wired to protect themselves from what they perceive as emotional pressure. They might ghost for a few days, dodge serious conversations, or minimize expressions of love. They're the avoidant one. The relationship between these two people often becomes a dance. The more the anxious person pursues, the more the avoidant withdraws. The more the avoidant pulls away, the more the anxious person panics and tries to fix things. It's a frustrating cycle, and both people end up feeling misunderstood. The anxious one believes they're just trying to connect, and the avoidant one believes they're trying to maintain their boundaries. But in reality, what's happening is a pattern of emotional misalignment that's hard to break without awareness. The anxious individual isn't needy in the way it's often negatively portrayed. They simply crave emotional closeness as a form of security. It's how they interpret love. They're scanning for signs of disconnection because to them, disconnection equals danger. It brings up feelings of abandonment, past rejection, and deep-seated fears of not being enough. So naturally, they try to secure the relationship through action. They may overfunction emotionally, constantly checking in, offering love, affection, and reassurance even when it's not being reciprocated. But that emotional energy often overwhelms the avoidant partner who starts to feel engulfed, pressured, or even trapped. The avoidant person, meanwhile, isn't cold or uncaring at their core. They've likely developed a deep-rooted belief that emotional dependence is risky. Maybe they grew up in environments where vulnerability led to disappointment, or where their own emotional needs were never met. So now, when someone gets close, it activates a survival response. They instinctively pull away to maintain a sense of emotional safety. Their distance isn't designed to hurt the anxious partner. It's a reflex they've relied on to avoid the discomfort of intimacy. What often makes this dynamic so intense is that both people are activating each other's deepest fears without realizing it. The anxious person fears abandonment, so they chase. The avoidant person fears being engulfed or controlled, so they retreat. But the more one chases, the more the other runs. And so the cycle continues. It's not about who loves more or less. It's about how each person relates to closeness and distance. Understanding this dynamic is the first real step to breaking free from it. It's not enough to label someone as too anxious or too avoidant. Those labels can oversimplify what are actually very human coping mechanisms. What matters more is the awareness of what's driving the behavior. Once you understand that this isn't just about one person being too much or the other not caring enough, but about attachment patterns learned over years of emotional conditioning, you start to see the full picture. And with that awareness comes the power to change the pattern. In a relationship where one person tends to be anxious and the other avoidant, there's an invisible agreement that forms, even though neither person consciously signs up for it. The anxious partner becomes the emotional driver, constantly trying to bridge the gap, keep the connection alive, and maintain closeness. The avoidant partner, whether they realize it or not, gets comfortable with this dynamic. They begin to rely on the fact that the anxious person will always be the one to reach out, apologize first, initiate contact, and bring up the hard conversations. It becomes a silent expectation. The anxious person will do the work, and the avoidant person can stay emotionally guarded without risking the loss of the relationship. This pursuit and distance cycle creates a very specific comfort zone for the avoidant partner. As long as they know the anxious person is still invested, still chasing, still worrying, still trying, they don't have to confront their own emotional discomfort. They can stay at a distance, knowing that the relationship is still intact, even if they're not actively contributing to its emotional health. The anxious person's pursuit becomes a safety net. It reassures the avoidant that they are still wanted, still desired, still emotionally significant. And as long as that energy is coming toward them, they can maintain control of how much they engage or how much they avoid. What often goes unnoticed is how the avoidant's emotional distance isn't just a personality trait, it's a response to a deeper need to protect themselves. The more the anxious person chases, the more space the avoidant feels they need in order to stay comfortable. Not because they want to hurt the other person, but because they equate closeness with pressure or loss of freedom. In their mind, the moment someone gets too close is the moment they risk losing themselves. So they pull away, withdraw emotionally, or delay commitment. Not because they don't feel anything, but because the pace of emotional intimacy feels overwhelming. But here's the part that changes everything. The more the anxious person chases, the less the avoidant partner feels the need to step up emotionally. As long as someone else is doing the emotional heavy lifting, the avoidant can avoid the deeper work of showing up, being vulnerable, and facing their own emotional limitations. They're comfortable, not because the relationship is fulfilling, but because it doesn't demand much from them. The dynamic itself protects them from having to stretch or evolve. This emotional imbalance often leads to frustration and burnout for the anxious partner. They're giving so much, adjusting constantly, and trying to make the relationship feel secure. Yet they're met with inconsistency or emotional unavailability. They begin to feel like they're carrying the whole connection on their shoulders. But from the avoidance perspective, nothing seems wrong because their emotional needs are being met in a different way. They get the reassurance of being wanted without having to give more than they're comfortable with. It's a passive benefit that allows them to stay in the relationship without confronting what it actually means to be emotionally present. Over time, this dynamic can become incredibly lopsided. The anxious person becomes increasingly dissatisfied, constantly trying to decode mixed signals, while the avoidant partner becomes more settled in a relationship that lets them stay emotionally distant without consequence. The anxious partner might even start to question their own worth, thinking that if they were just more patient, more relaxed, less emotional, then maybe their partner would come closer. But all the while, the avoidant has become conditioned to expect that love will come to them, without needing to truly participate in the emotional give and take that healthy relationships require. This unspoken balance of effort keeps the avoidant comfortable in a dynamic that never asks them to grow beyond their fears. When the anxious partner finally detaches, something fundamental shifts in the dynamic that once defined the relationship. It doesn't always happen overnight. It's usually the result of emotional exhaustion, countless unanswered efforts, and the growing realization that no amount of chasing will ever create the connection they've been craving. But when it happens, it's unmistakable. The texts slow down or stop altogether. The questions and check-ins disappear. The anxious person no longer tries to decode every word, every pause, every moment of distance. And this silence, this space, is not just the absence of effort, it's the presence of a new boundary. For the avoidant partner, this shift is often deeply unsettling, though they may not understand why at first. They've grown used to being pursued, to being the one with the emotional upper hand. When the anxious partner was leaning in, it allowed the avoidant to lean back without consequences. That distance kept them safe. But now, the very thing they relied on, the energy coming toward them, is gone. And suddenly, the balance of the relationship feels unfamiliar, even unstable. At first, the avoidant partner might feel a sense of relief. There's no pressure to respond, no emotional tension to manage, no expectations being placed on them. But that relief is short-lived. Because underneath it is a growing discomfort. Where did the attention go? Why isn't the anxious partner reaching out like before? Why does the silence feel louder than the noise ever did? The avoidant partner might begin to wonder if the anxious one is losing interest, moving on, or worse, realizing they deserve more. And that thought alone is enough to trigger panic. Not because of love in the traditional sense, but because the dynamic that once allowed them to feel in control is now slipping away. This panic doesn't always show up dramatically. It can look subtle, like suddenly liking a post, replying to a message they ignored days ago, or casually reaching out after a long silence. But behind that casual tone is often a deeper emotional disruption. The avoidant starts to feel the void left behind by the anxious partner's absence. They might not say it outright, but something doesn't feel right to them anymore. The relationship no longer follows the script they were used to, and the stability they once felt, based on the predictability of being chased, is now gone. For the anxious person, detachment doesn't mean they no longer care. It often means they've reached a point where protecting their own emotional well-being matters more than holding on to hope. It's not apathy, it's self-preservation. It's the recognition that constantly chasing someone who won't meet them halfway only leads to pain. This emotional shift, while difficult, is incredibly powerful. It puts the anxious person back in control of their peace, their energy, and their worth. And for the avoidant, it presents a challenge they've often been able to avoid. How do they respond when the emotional safety net disappears? Without the anxious partner constantly filling the space, the avoidant is left to sit with their own discomfort. They can no longer rely on someone else to maintain the connection. If they want closeness now, they have to move toward it themselves. They have to take emotional risks, initiate conversations, and confront the vulnerability they've spent so long avoiding. And for someone who's used to avoiding discomfort, this can feel like a terrifying shift. But it also becomes a moment of reckoning, a moment that reveals whether they're willing to grow beyond the safety of avoidance or retreat back into it. Either way, the dynamic has changed, and neither person can go back to the pattern that once defined them. When the anxious partner finally stops feeding the connection, the avoidant partner begins to feel the impact in ways they never anticipated. For so long, they operated in a dynamic where they held emotional control, not because they were consciously manipulating it, but because the structure of the relationship allowed it. The anxious partner's persistent energy kept things going. The texts, the check-ins, the emotional availability, the attempts to repair and reconnect. The avoidant became accustomed to this presence, even if they didn't always appreciate it or acknowledge it out loud. They may have even pushed it away, needing space, needing silence, needing to regulate on their own terms. But now, without warning, the emotional supply they relied on has dried up. This emotional supply isn't always about attention in a romanticized way. It's about the comfort of knowing someone is there, consistently trying. It's about knowing they could come back at any time and find the anxious person waiting. That kind of certainty creates a psychological cushion. It allows the avoidant to delay vulnerability, to postpone hard conversations, to keep intimacy at a safe distance without fearing the loss of the connection. But when that emotional presence is removed, even subtly, the avoidant starts to feel something they've spent a long time avoiding: emotional uncertainty. At first, the absence may register as confusion. They may wonder if the anxious person is just upset, taking space, playing a game. But as time goes on and the silence lingers, panic starts to settle in. The chase they once found overwhelming is now strangely missed. The messages they once ignored become noticeable in their absence. The effort they once found suffocating begins to feel like it was actually grounding. It hits them that what they were once trying to get away from was also the thing that was holding the relationship together. This panic doesn't always surface in clear emotional language. The avoidant may not even realize it's panic at first, but their behavior shifts. They might reach out in indirect ways, checking in with a vague message, commenting on something they normally wouldn't. They may suddenly initiate plans or express concern in a way they previously withheld. It's not necessarily that they've had a profound emotional breakthrough, it's that their sense of emotional control has been disrupted and they don't know how to regain it. The panic is often less about missing the anxious person specifically and more about the anxiety of losing what they didn't think could be lost. This moment can be deeply confusing for the avoidant partner. For so long, they've associated closeness with discomfort, and now they're discovering that absence also feels unsafe. They're confronted with a contradiction. The relationship they wanted to keep at a distance now feels disturbingly far away. It forces them to question their assumptions. Were they actually overwhelmed by the anxious partner, or were they overwhelmed by their own fear of intimacy? Was the problem really the other person's emotional needs, or was it their inability to meet those needs without feeling vulnerable? As they sit with these questions, the avoidant often experiences a kind of emotional whiplash. The very behaviors they use to resist now become the ones they find themselves craving. They may not say it outright, and they might not show it in obvious ways, but there's an internal urgency building. The silence that once felt like freedom now feels like distance they can't bridge without confronting their own emotional blocks. They're forced to reckon with the reality that connection requires effort, presence, and vulnerability, not just from the person pursuing, but from both sides. And that panic they're feeling, it's the emotional alarm signaling that something they counted on being there is no longer guaranteed. When the anxious partner finally chooses to stop chasing and the avoidant begins to feel the discomfort of that silence, the entire emotional landscape of the relationship starts to shift. That familiar rhythm, the push, the pull, the reaching and the retreating, suddenly loses its grip. And in the stillness, both people are left to confront what has really been happening beneath the surface. It's in this moment, this uncomfortable in-between, where real growth begins. Not because someone else changed, but because the pattern itself broke wide open. The anxious partner is no longer operating from a place of fear, and the avoidant is no longer protected by emotional distance. There's no longer a predictable dance, which means there's nowhere left to hide from the truth of what each person brings into the relationship. For the anxious person, this is where the transformation becomes visible. No longer investing in the chase gives them space to actually see the dynamic clearly for the first time. They begin to realize that their worth isn't tied to how much they give or how much they're willing to endure. They're no longer trying to win love through sacrifice or keep someone by proving how committed they are. Instead, they start tuning into their own emotional needs, the kind that were neglected in the pursuit of someone who couldn't meet them halfway. That self-awareness builds resilience. It rewrites the narrative from one of chasing love to one of choosing it with someone capable of showing up. At the same time, the avoidant partner is being pushed into emotional territory they've spent most of their lives trying to avoid. When the anxious person was always there, they never had to confront the consequences of emotional distance. They never had to ask themselves why they pull away when things get close, or why vulnerability feels so threatening. But now, without the constant reassurance and effort from their partner, they have to make a decision. They can either continue retreating and lose something meaningful, or they can lean into the discomfort and grow. Growth in this case doesn't look like a grand gesture or a sudden change in personality. It's about emotional accountability. It's about recognizing that healthy relationships require participation, not passive comfort. This breaking of the cycle is uncomfortable for both people, but that discomfort is what makes space for healing. For the anxious person, it means learning to soothe their own fears without relying on someone else to make them feel secure. It means understanding that real love doesn't require proving yourself or working endlessly to keep someone's attention. For the avoidant, it means seeing that intimacy doesn't equal loss of freedom and that emotional safety isn't found in distance. It's found in honesty, presence, and mutual effort. These are lessons that don't come easily, but they come with clarity. What was once a relationship driven by unconscious needs and reflexive behaviors now becomes a mirror. Each person begins to see the role they've been playing, not as a fixed identity, but as a survival strategy. And when those strategies are no longer needed, when they're replaced by self-awareness and emotional maturity, the entire dynamic transforms, not always into a perfect romance, but into something more grounded, either a healthier version of the relationship or a stronger, more empowered version of the individual walking away from it. Either way, the emotional work doesn't go to waste. It becomes the foundation for future connection, for a kind of love that doesn't rely on pursuit or avoidance, but on presence, reciprocity, and mutual respect.